who would you say are legitimate tough guys? Who are real tough guys that you would say outside the ring, yeah, this person's a real badass? Like for me, I looked at a guy, and I'm going way back. I looked at a guy like Bruiser Brody, and I'm like, that's the guy I don't want to mess with. A buddy of mine, he lived in Stone Park, and after the WWF matches, there was a all-night bar called the Str8 in Stone Park, where a lot of guys would go after the matches. And Francois Wright, shout out to Francois Wright, he wasn't able to be on the show tonight, but he said that he was in the Str8, and some of the guys were drinking. It was Arn Anderson and Lex Luger, some other guys, and they're just having a good time. And one of the guys in this group got into a disagreement with Arn Anderson over a young lady. And my buddy Francois Wright, he's 6'5", all of 230, 240 pounds as a basketball player, but he's not a small guy. But he talks about, I made a business decision to diffuse the situation because I'm not taking on Arn Anderson because that's a legit, real tough guy. That's a badass. So, you hear these stories about, some people are in character, but this is also who they are as a person. Is there a wrestler, either independent or mainstream wrestling, WWE, AEW, that you say, wow, that's a legit badass that I'm not going to mess with outside the ring? I don't want to catch him in the bar or talk trash to him because there's nothing between us but air and opportunity, and I'm not trying to close that distance. Is there a wrestler? Let's start with Tom, and then we'll go Steve, and then Demetrius.
Well, I mean, going back a little bit, there's so many stories in pro wrestling about this one particular guy who nobody will screw with, and his name is Ming, or he was known as Haku.
Yes. Oh, yes.
He was like a legit badass, and like nobody wanted to mess with him. I mean, there are stories about him literally ripping a guy's teeth out of his head in a bar fight because he said wrestling was fake. And stuff like that. And another one was a little bit further back was Harley Race.
Yes,
a legit tough guy. I mean, Harley Race, as the story goes, as Bobby Heenan would tell it, one of the only guys that Andre the Giant was afraid of. So wow. if Andre's afraid of the guy, I'm definitely not going to screw with him. But in today's wrestling, I mean, I think the obvious one is Brock Lesnar, because he was a legit MMA fighter, UFC champion. So I'm not thinking anybody's going to physically want to mess with him. But I don't know, because you don't hear about wrestlers being tough guys outside the ring anymore because of stuff like social media and because it will spread like wildfire. So, you don't hear those stories really too much anymore. Another one is Mick Foley. This is a guy that got his ear ripped off and finished the match. So, outside of Brock Lesnar, just because of his MMA background, I'd have a hard time, picking somebody from the current crop of wrestlers just because news spreads too fast for any of that kind of stuff to go on.
It's interesting that you mentioned Haku because, again, I call him my big brother, Francois Wright. He talks about, that was the guy you didn't want to mess with. There were so many stories, and, everybody's not lying. And everybody had a story that it just sounded so unbelievable that, God, this is almost too believable, because who would make these types of things up? So absolutely. So you're not the only one. Steve, how about you?
Demetrius mentioned Japan earlier. I will go overseas to a New Japan star who actually was on a show for us this past December. His name is Minoru Suzuki.
Okay.
And Suzuki was a big star in New Japan Pro Wrestling. And then in the early to mid 90s, he stepped away from wrestling to be one of the pioneers of MMA in Japan, an organization called Pancrase, which was one of the front runners before UFC and before all this. So he was a badass in wrestling. He went into MMA, has a ridiculous winning record in MMA, and then has come back into wrestling. And he did both in the early 2000s, and now he's been mostly just wrestling from 2010 onward. But he's 52 years old now, and everyone has this unbelievable respect for him because he is such a badass. And quick story, Tom Lawler, Filthy Tom Lawler, who's a former UFC fighter and an independent pro wrestler. He's on a bunch of our shows too. Awesome guy. It's been Tom's dream to fight Minoru Suzuki. Well, they got to have the fight in our December show. And from the audience's perspective, it was a bloodbath. I mean, just forearms and smashes and whatever. And we're watching it backstage like, oh God, we're gonna have to take Tom to the hospital. And I remember talking to Tom after the show, and I said, so Tom, how was it? Are you standing? He goes, I never got touched. He said, Suzuki is such a physical specimen and so good at real combat and pro wrestling that he could make the promoters think that Tom got murdered.
Wow.
And Tom didn't feel a thing. And that just shows you how good of a real badass he is and how much control he has of his body. Like I think about like Bruce Lee, if you guys are Bruce Lee fans, and one of the most impressive things about Bruce Lee was not his strength, his speed, it was his control. And that's what I think about with this guy named Minoru Suzuki. So if you've never heard of him, go look him up. Total badass.
And it sounds like having that level of professional skill provides a laser focus. So he knows just how far to go. And like you said, it's concentrated and controlled. Wow, that's a phenomenal story. Demetrius, how about you?
I love that story, Steve.
I know.
That's what I call pro shit. There's a reason why Suzuki's been making money for 20, 30 years, and there's kids who'll kill themselves in their backyard with nobody watching and think they're doing something. That is the level between, you know, some guys rolling around, some guys whatever, and then there's that pro stuff. That's I love that. And a lot like Tom, I'm having a hard time trying to think of in the post kayfabe era that we're in, like real tough guys. Back in the day, you know, wrestling on TV is always, well, definitely back in the 80s, wrestling on TV was a big old infomercial, like a regional infomercial. We're having this show at your town on this day, and so we're hyping it up on TV. And then after TV, a lot of these guys would go into the local pubs and bars and whatever and start beating guys up to kind of boost their street cred or whatever, and that would lead to sometimes to people going to shows. And now we live in this day and age where that's not even really prudent anymore. So you don't really see that so much the tough guy in today's performers. But I've probably gotten into a Google hole when it comes to Ming stories that are just, you could literally spend all day just Googling Ming stories, how a cop pepper sprayed him and he just opened his mouth and took it like it was like it was.
Oh, wow. Unbelievable.
Right, like he just gargled it or something, like ripping somebody's nose off in a bar fight, just all kinds of stuff you hear about him. And to let him tell it, it was always in defense of his friends. It wasn't to prove a point. It was just protecting the business and protecting his friends. So Ming would probably be my all-time, like, legit tough guy. But also kind of like what Steve said, there's a guy out now named Bobby Lashley. And he was in professional wrestling and mixed martial arts at the same time, which just blows my mind that anybody could pull that off. Had a really impressive record in mixed martial arts while keeping up a full-time professional wrestling schedule. So I don't know if that makes him, you know, if nothing else, that makes him mentally tough than most other people.
Yeah, that's huge to be able to do both. And